We're going to be using 4 different methods: stamping, die cuts, stencil, and paint to make rainbow cards. So we're going to start out with stamping, and the stamp platform that I'm using here is a Tim Holtz stamp platform, which is no longer available in the United States. I will link to a blog post I did about all the options that are available these days, and hopefully you will find that useful if you're in the market for a stamp platform. With these big rainbow pieces, I don't know of any other way to make this work. The background that I'm going to use for this card is that embossed piece that's on the table, and I just pulled that out of my opportunity box. That's just where I throw all the extras when I'm crafting. Whatever I've got left over, I toss it aside and pick it up for some other project. So it comes in handy. Now, once I've chosen the sentiment, I'm going to stamp that actually using an acrylic block to put onto the card. I don't have a matching die set for this stamp set, but fussy cutting works just fine. So from the stamping approach, we're going to move on to the die cutting approach. And the die machine that I'm showing is a Sizzix Bigz, and this is what you will find if you are shopping used. Facebook Marketplace, thrift store, garage sale. Wherever you are, this is what you're going to find, just statistically speaking. So anytime you encounter one of these machines used, if the handle turns, it works. There are a few pieces that are crucial to making the die machine work for you, and I will link to a blog post where I outline the prices of the contemporary alternatives and tell you the pieces that are required. If you can pick one of these up used, it's really worthwhile, I think. The die cutting does take a little while because obviously each stripe of the rainbow is a different color. The steel rule die, the Bigz, comes with its own background because you can assemble everything on the biggest piece. But the thinlits don't have their own background, and so I'm tracing out the largest arch in order to make my own background, and I'm tracing the inner arch as well, although I can perfect that later. And then on the copy paper, I'm just assembling the stripes. And now I'm going to true up that inner piece before I glue on the very last red layer on the very inside edge. From the die cutting, we're going to move on to stenciling. And the stenciling in total took 12 minutes, and the stencil itself only cost $9. So I thought this was one of the better methods. I'm going to mask off the rainbow area using a Post-it note that has full adhesive. It's not just a strip of adhesive at the top, it's fully adhesive. You could use masking paper, that would work. I don't happen to have any, and I did have a fully adhesive Post-it note, so that worked out great. Probably the most time-consuming aspect of the stenciling is not making the clouds, not stenciling the rainbow stripes. It was really all the taping that you have to do, because the stencil, you can see, has got some little holes for extra clouds, and it's got some edges there to make a cloud bank, and all that stuff has to be blocked off before you can stencil in the rainbow stripes. So that took most of the 12 minutes that the stenciling method took. The background that I'm working on here is a silicone placemat. That white that you can see is acrylic paint, and that will come right off when I take this to the sink to wash it. So I do like it for keeping my work surface pretty clean anytime that I'm using paint or glue. Water mediums like dye ink and so forth will just come right off of Formica tabletop, but acrylic paint, once you get it on something, is forever. So the stenciling into the rainbow stripes I'm doing with a makeup sponge. These are very dense makeup sponges, and I'll have a link to these below too if you're interested. Any kind of makeup sponge will work. Any kind of makeup brush would work for the blending. They really are remarkably similar, so just pick whatever's handy. Now we're going to go on to watercoloring, and I'm putting my Post-it note mask down, and the mask is not going to block off the space underneath. I'm using the mask for a visual reminder of where to put the clear water, and I'm going to lay the ink into the clear water to make my background. If I get water under the mask, the ink will flow right under that mask. That Post-it note is not doing anything. It's just a visual reminder to me where I want to paint and where I don't want to paint. Once you put the clear water down, the ink is going to follow the water, and you could do this. I'm using an ink pad that's smushed onto my silicone surface. You could use genuine watercolor, you could use distress crayons or any other gel crayon. Whatever water medium you want to use is going to work the same. Now that I've removed the mask, I'm going to pick up just a little bit of water, and again the color is going to follow the water layer. I'm going to put a little red in there so you can see what I'm doing, but I'm just making a water trail for that layer of the rainbow, and then I'm dropping the ink into that water trail to make my colored band. Now when you're working with a water medium, you need to let the layers dry, so you don't want to go from red straight to orange. I'm going to go from red to purple so that I can see the inner and outer rings, so I have an idea of spacing. But you would want to skip over orange and do yellow, skip over green and do blue. You want to space them out and give them a little bit of time to dry. The watercoloring did take a little bit longer than stenciling. Exclusive of drying time, it took 14 minutes. And you could do this with a water brush instead of with a paintbrush if you want to. I happen to live in a really humid climate, and so water brushes do over time tend to grow mold. That's why I'm using a paintbrush, but if you live someplace just a tiny bit drier than 100% humidity, a water brush would work just fine. So once you let everything dry and you paint all your layers, you do end up with a rather charming handmade look compared to the stencil. But you probably already have all of these materials on hand, and that's what's attractive, I think, about the watercolor version. Just if you're a crafter that does any kind of stamping, you probably have ink pads, you probably have a water brush or paintbrush, and that makes this very, very easy. Now I did use genuine watercolor paper for this. Any kind of mixed media paper would do just fine, or even a really heavyweight cardstock. The more water you put on it, the more you really need actual watercolor. But Canson is fine, Strathmore's fine, any brand of watercolor paper is going to take this type of painting. You're not an artist, doesn't need to be super special. Now we're going to move on to gel crayons. This, your kids may have these, or if you like distress crayons, or if you are an actual, if you have actual drawing skills, you may have water-soluble pastels. Basically, that's this class of product. So once I've drawn these on freehand, I am picking up just a little bit of water with my paintbrush to kind of smooth out the blend between. With this medium, you do not need to wait for one color to dry to do the color next to it. So it's very fast. I think the crayon version of this took 8 minutes. Now I am going to also use the gel crayons to make the background. Here I'm just choosing a light blue color with a little bit of water to paint on a background. Now I do end up cutting this out, but I think it looks fine on that blue background. Now we're going to move on to acrylic paints. And the thing about acrylic paint is that this is not the application for your good water brush. It's not an application for your good watercolor brush, your good water brush, or a brush that you're going to use for anything besides acrylic paint, because the paint gets into the brush, it's really hard to get out, it kind of ruins it. So that's why I've got this brush marked with some washi tape so that I know that this is my acrylic brush. It gets a little stiff over time. I think this is an Artist Loft brand, so I don't mind sacrificing it. And you do have to let this dry a little bit between the layers, but acrylic paint dries really quickly. And this is how our stenciling and painting turned out. And now these are the cards. So we're going to start off with the gel crayon version. This is a thinlit die, a thin steel die on a stamped background out of the Opportunity box. This is the acrylic paint version on a solid color paper background. This is the stencil version. I think that turned out great. The stencil one looks fabulous. Then we have the watercolor version, very charming and handmade. Then we're going to move on from the watercolor to another thinlit set on an ink blended background. Then we're going to move on to one of the steel rule die versions on a colored paper background, steel rule die on an ink blended background, and then our stamped version. Thanks for joining me today.